Lucas Bennett's life was built on precision. As the CEO of a successful tech company, he had learned the value of time and order early on. Every day followed a schedule: meetings, calls, emails, reports, and more reports. It was a well-oiled machine, a predictable flow of events that left little room for anything unplanned or unexpected. For Lucas, structure was not just a preference, it was a way of life. But there was one area of his life where structure seemed to elude him: his role as a single father to his daughter, Lily. Lucas had always prided himself on his ability to manage his company with the same attention to detail that he applied to every other aspect of his life. He rose early, worked late, and lived by the mantra of efficiency. His office was spotless, everything in its place, just the way he liked it. Yet when it came to raising Lily, a bright and curious 8-year-old, Lucas found himself at a loss. No matter how much he tried to maintain the same level of control, being both a CEO and a single father was far more complicated than he had imagined. It had been years since his wife had passed away, leaving him to raise Lily on his own. He loved her more than anything in the world, but the reality of balancing a high-powered career and the demands of parenthood was becoming increasingly difficult. Mornings were the hardest, while Lucas prepared for the day ahead, dressing in his sharp suits, reviewing his schedule, and organizing his thoughts for back-to-back meetings. Lily sat alone at the kitchen table, eating her cereal in silence. He could hear the faint hum of her small voice as she spoke to her stuffed bear, but there was a sadness in her quiet solitude that weighed on him. She had grown so much, and yet she seemed so alone sometimes. Despite his professional success, Lucas couldn't shake the guilt that accompanied his work-life balance. There was always something more important that needed his attention. Another meeting, another deadline, another phone call. He promised Lily the best life possible, but lately, it felt like the promise was becoming harder to keep. She was thriving in school, but as her grades improved, so did the complexity of her academic challenges. Lucas wanted to be the father who could help her with her schoolwork, who could sit beside her at the kitchen table and guide her through her lessons. But his days were filled to the brim, and his mind was constantly racing from one task to the next. It was beginning to feel like the more successful he became, the less present he was in Lily's life. One morning, as Lucas sat in his office chair, adjusting his cufflinks, his eyes once again flicked over to the picture frame on his desk. The photo of Lily smiling brightly with her stuffed bear reminded him of the little girl he had promised to protect and care for. She was his reason for working tirelessly, day in and day out. But no matter how many hours he spent in his office, no matter how many contracts he signed or deals he closed, it never felt like enough. He could provide for her, but could he give her what she truly needed? The phone buzzed on his desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a reminder from Lily's school. Another parent-teacher meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, and he needed to bring her updated schoolwork for discussion. Lucas winced. Another reminder of how difficult it was to manage everything. He typed a quick reply, confirming his attendance, before glancing at the stack of documents waiting on his desk. A meeting with potential investors, a report on new software, and a strategy session with his team. His day was packed. His mind was already whirring, thinking about the next item on his agenda. But then, as his eyes scanned the list, a realization hit him. He had promised Lily that he would be there for her, and today, like many others, it felt like he was failing her. The balance was slipping. Lucas had spent years building his career, meticulously crafting every decision, every strategy, and every deal. But when it came to raising Lily, he couldn't apply the same precision. She needed something more than an organized schedule. She needed a connection that he wasn't sure how to provide. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt out of control. His thoughts swirled, and for a moment, he considered his options. He could keep going, pushing through the chaos, but he knew that wouldn't be enough. He needed help. Not just any help. He needed someone who could step into his life with the same level of precision and discipline that he applied to his work. someone who could guide Lily through her schoolwork, someone who could provide the structure and support that he simply didn't have the time or energy to offer. It wasn't an easy decision. Lucas had always prided himself on doing everything himself. But the truth was, he couldn't do it all anymore. He needed to find someone who could take on the responsibility of helping Lily with her education. He did some research, asked for recommendations, and after much deliberation, he found a tutor who came highly recommended, a woman named Clara Webb, who was known for her discipline, structure, and experience. Lucas quickly set up an interview and confirmed it via email. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Finally, he felt like he had a solution. He would have someone else step in, someone who could manage this part of his life, while he focused on the other responsibilities that consumed his time. For the first time that morning, Lucas allowed himself a brief moment of peace. Maybe, just maybe, things would finally fall into place. But little did he know, the woman who would walk into his life next would be nothing like he expected. And she was about to change everything. The doorbell rang at precisely 1 p.m., just as Lucas was beginning to prepare for another round of back-to-back meetings. His office was quiet now, but his mind was still buzzing with everything on his plate. As he adjusted his tie and straightened his desk, Lucas glanced at the clock and took a deep breath. The tutor was due any minute now, and for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope that this could be the answer he'd been looking for. Lily needed help, and he needed the peace of mind that came with knowing she was being taken care of, both academically and emotionally. Lucas walked briskly across the polished hardwood floor of his apartment, his heels clicking against the floor as he neared the door. He had been anticipating the arrival of Clara Webb for days now. Based on the glowing recommendations from colleagues and friends, he had no doubt that she was the right person for the job. Organized, structured, and a seasoned professional, Clara seemed like the perfect fit for his well-ordered life. He had high hopes that she would provide the discipline and routine that Lily needed, and that would allow him to focus on his demanding career. When Lucas opened the door, he was immediately taken aback. Standing before him was not the serious, buttoned-up professional he had envisioned. Instead, he was greeted by a woman with a bright, infectious smile, her curly hair framing her face in a carefree, slightly untamed fashion. She wore a flowing, vibrant bohemian dress that seemed out of place in his carefully curated, minimalist apartment. The contrast between her free-spirited appearance and his well-ordered corporate world was stark. "Hi," she greeted, her voice warm and inviting. "I'm Clara. I'm here to tutor Lily. Can I come in?" Lucas blinked, caught off guard by the casualness of her demeanor. His mind quickly scrambled to regain its composure as he stepped aside to let her in. He had expected someone who exuded professionalism in every sense of the word, someone who was polished and formal. But Clara was not what he had anticipated. Just to clarify," Lucas said, his voice coming out a little more stiffly than he had intended. "Are you sure you're the right person? I was expecting someone with more experience, perhaps a more formal approach." Clara gave him a playful grin, as though amused by his rigidity. "I promise, I'm exactly what Lily needs," she said with confidence. "I've tutored before, lots of kids. I just don't believe in the whole strict rulebook approach. Kids learn better when they're having fun, right?" Lucas' brow furrowed slightly. Fun. He wasn't sure how he felt about that word being associated with education. But there was no turning back now. He had already made the commitment. Clara was here, and whether he liked it or not, he had to give her a chance. "I'd like to see your credentials," Lucas said, still clinging to his need for some assurance. It wasn't that he doubted her abilities. It was just that her appearance was so different from what he had expected. Clara waved a hand dismissively, as though credentials were nothing more than a formality she could easily bypass. "I have them, of course," she said, her voice light. "But Ellie's the proof. I believe in showing, not telling. If you give me a chance, I'll show you exactly how I can help her." Lucas wasn't entirely convinced. The skepticism in his mind swirled, and he found himself wondering if he had made a mistake. Was Clara truly capable of guiding Lily's education, or was he simply indulging her whims? He had hired her based on her recommendations, but standing here, facing her in person, his doubts grew. She didn't look like the tutor he had envisioned, someone with textbooks and a strict agenda. But there was something about Clara, something that piqued his curiosity. It was her ease, the way she seemed so naturally comfortable in her own skin, the way she exuded confidence without any need to prove herself. That confidence intrigued Lucas, despite himself. Maybe she wasn't like the others, but perhaps that was a good thing. Maybe Lily needed someone who didn't fit the mold, someone who could think outside the box and bring a different energy into their home. I'm not sure. Lucas hesitated, feeling torn. But okay, 1 week. We'll see how it goes. But I want structure. I want results. No distractions. Clara's smile widened, and she nodded enthusiastically. Of course, she said, her voice smooth and reassuring. I think we'll get along just fine. Lucas stood frozen for a moment, his arms crossed, still unsure of what to make of this whole situation. Clara had a certain lightness about her, a free-spiritedness that didn't align with his usual need for control. But something inside him, a small voice he hadn't listened to in a while, told him that maybe this wasn't such a bad thing. Clara walked past him toward the living room where Lily was waiting. Lucas watched her go, his mind racing. He was still uncertain about the entire situation, but something in the way she moved, the way she interacted with the space, made him feel something. It was almost as if she belonged here already, even though she hadn't been in their lives for more than 5 minutes. As Clara settled in with Lily, engaging her with a warm and playful energy, Lucas stood in the doorway, watching them. There was something magnetic about Clara's presence. Lily, who usually struggled to focus on schoolwork, was already drawn to Clara, eager to participate. Lucas couldn't deny the connection between them. It was instantaneous. But still, he watched with caution, wondering if this was a fleeting moment or something more. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt like his structured world was being shaken by the very person he had hired to bring order into it. And despite himself, he was starting to wonder if this shift might not be so bad after all. As the days passed, the contrast between Lucas and Clara's teaching methods grew more apparent. Lucas, ever the perfectionist, struggled to understand why Clara's free-spirited approach to teaching seemed to resonate so well with Lily. His world was defined by schedules, timelines, and results. Everything he did, from managing his company to raising his daughter, had a methodical rhythm. But Clara's presence, with her unpredictable nature and playful ways, felt like a disruption to the precise order he had worked so hard to create. At first, the differences were subtle. Clara's lessons with Lily involved colorful building blocks, music, and impromptu games, none of which had been part of Lucas's carefully crafted educational plan. Lucas watched, arms crossed, as Lily dove headfirst into these activities, laughing and learning in ways that he hadn't expected. Despite his skepticism, Lucas couldn't help but notice that Lily was more engaged than he had ever seen her before. She was excited to do her homework, eager to show off her latest creations, and even began asking questions about things that Lucas would have never thought to teach her at such a young age. But with every new lesson, Lucas's frustration grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's approach lacked the structure and discipline that he valued so highly. His carefully designed curriculum, one that promised clear goals and outcomes, seemed to be slipping away. Lucas had spent years in the corporate world, managing teams and setting strategies, all with an eye toward achieving results. In his mind, teaching was no different. It was about results, progress, and meeting expectations. "Clara, we need to stick to the plan," Lucas said one afternoon, his voice tight as he watched Clara guide Lily through another unstructured lesson. Clara had turned math into a creative art project, And while Lucas appreciated the enthusiasm, he couldn't help but feel the lesson was a waste of time. Clara, unfazed by his interruption, glanced up with a calm smile. "Lucas, Ellie is learning," she said, her voice smooth and soothing. "She's not just memorizing facts. She's building understanding. Do you see how she's focused? That's what matters." Lucas shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "But she's not following the curriculum. She's not making progress according to the schedule I set. This isn't about just having fun, Clara. It's about results." Clara's smile didn't falter, but there was a glint of challenge in her eyes. "And what if the results aren't always measurable by a textbook or a schedule?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. "What if the real progress is in her confidence, her curiosity, her ability to think on her feet? Isn't that just as important?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. The words hit him like a wave, pushing against the walls he had spent years building. He had always believed in a clear, structured path to success. For him, the world was full of deadlines, meetings, and tangible outcomes, but Clara's question lingered in the air, a challenge he wasn't quite ready to accept. The tension between them began to grow. Lucas found himself growing more and more distant as Clara continued to break the rules he had set. The discomfort he felt was palpable, as though his very foundation was being tested. He would sit quietly in the background, watching Lily and Clara interact, but he couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that he wasn't in control. He had always been in control, hadn't he? Of his work, of his life, of his daughter's future. And yet here was Clara, this woman who didn't follow the rules, who taught with passion and spontaneity, and who was winning over his daughter with every lesson. It felt like a betrayal of everything Lucas had worked for, everything he had believed in. One evening, as the lesson ended and Clara packed up her materials, Lucas couldn't hold back his thoughts any longer. He walked into the living room, his voice stern. "Clara, this needs to stop," he said, his words cold. "I hired you to tutor Ellie, not to entertain her. This isn't what we agreed on." Clara paused, her hand resting on the stack of colorful index cards. She looked up at Lucas, her expression unreadable. "What we agreed on, Lucas," she said quietly, "was that Ellie would get the help she needed. And I'm giving her that help, just in a way that you might not understand. You hired me because you wanted her to learn, right?" Lucas swallowed hard. The question struck a chord deep within him. Of course, he wanted Lily to learn. But more than that, he wanted her to succeed, to follow a clear path that would lead her to success in life. But Clara wasn't just teaching her academics. She was teaching her how to live, how to engage with the world in a way that Lucas hadn't anticipated. "I need structure," Lucas said, his voice thick with frustration. "I can't just throw out everything we've planned because of some whim. This isn't about fun, Clara. It's about results. It's about her future." Clara met his gaze, her eyes calm yet piercing. And what if her future isn't about following a strict schedule? What if it's about learning to love the process? What if she needs space to grow, to explore, to make mistakes? The words echoed in Lucas's mind, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The thought of relinquishing control over Lily's education, of letting her learn without a clear structure, felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. But in that moment, as he watched Clara interact with Lily, her gentle encouragement, her infectious energy, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to teaching than just control and results. Clara didn't push him further. Instead, she smiled softly and picked up her bag. "I'll see you tomorrow, Lucas," she said, her voice warm but carrying an undercurrent of quiet determination. "Let's see what we can accomplish." As Clara walked out the door, Lucas stood in the living room, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts. The clash between his need for control and Clara's free-spirited methods was beginning to unravel him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He didn't want to admit it, but something inside him was shifting. He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't deny that the tension between them wasn't just about education. It was about something deeper. It was about how he viewed himself, his role as a father, and what it truly meant to give his daughter the best future. For the first time, Lucas was forced to ask himself, was control really the answer? Or was it time to let go and allow Lily the freedom to learn in her own way? The tension lingered in the air, thick and unresolved, as Lucas retreated into his thoughts. He knew one thing for sure. This trial was no longer just about Clara's teaching methods. It was about him, and whether he was ready to change everything he had believed in for so long. The days following their argument were filled with silence and uncertainty. Lucas spent hours at his desk, poring over his company's reports and emails, but his mind always wandered back to the same place, the confrontation with Clara. It wasn't that he regretted standing up for what he believed in. It was more that he felt something deep inside him beginning to crack. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his life, the strict boundaries he had set for his daughter, and the rigid structure he had relied on for years, seemed to be coming undone. Clara had left that day with a calm assurance that unsettled Lucas more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just her methods that challenged him. It was the way she had so effortlessly broken through the defenses he had built around his emotions. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every situation. But with Clara, he had been forced to face a side of himself he wasn't ready to confront. His fear of vulnerability, and his reluctance to let go of control. Lucas hadn't expected any change after that conversation. He had imagined that Clara would stick to her approach, and that he would eventually have to part ways with her. But as the days went by, something unexpected happened. He began to notice small shifts in Lily. Her face lit up every time Clara arrived for their lessons, and Lucas found himself hearing more laughter in the house. Lily was happy, truly happy, and despite himself, Lucas couldn't ignore it. It was a Saturday afternoon when the breakthrough came. Lucas had been sitting at the kitchen table, going over some work when he heard the sound of giggling from the living room. He knew that Clara had arrived for another lesson with Lily, but this time, something felt different. There was a lightness to the laughter that he hadn't heard before. It was genuine, unrestrained, and filled the room with a warmth that Lucas hadn't realized he was missing. He could hear Clara's voice, soft but enthusiastic, guiding Lily through another one of their unconventional lessons. Lucas set his work aside and stood up, walking cautiously toward the living room. When he peeked around the corner, he was met with a sight he hadn't anticipated. Clara and Lily were sitting on the floor, surrounded by a mess of colorful paper, markers, and crayons. They were making a giant collage, with Lily's drawings scattered across the table. Clara was holding up a piece of paper, laughing at something Lily had drawn, her eyes sparkling with admiration. Lily, for her part, was beaming with pride, showing off her work with a sense of accomplishment that Lucas hadn't seen before. In that moment, something inside him shifted. Watching Clara interact with Lily, seeing the joy on his daughter's face, Lucas realized that what he had been seeking all along wasn't perfection. It wasn't about following a strict curriculum or achieving results on a checklist. It was about connection, about trust, about allowing Lily to explore and learn in a way that was not confined by the boundaries Lucas had set for her. Clara noticed him standing in the doorway, her warm smile never faltering. "Come join us, Lucas," she called out, her voice inviting and easy. "It's more fun if you're involved." Lucas hesitated for a moment, the familiar walls of control rising within him. But then he saw Lily's eager expression, her face full of anticipation as she held up her latest creation. "Come on, Daddy," she said, her voice full of excitement. "You have to see this." For the first time in weeks, Lucas felt a sense of peace settle over him. The tension that had consumed him for so long melted away as he stepped into the living room and sat down beside Clara and Lily. He picked up a marker and, without thinking, began to add his own touch to the college. There were no deadlines, no expectations, just a moment of pure enjoyment. As they worked together, Lucas began to see the lesson in it all. He realized that teaching wasn't about controlling every moment, but about allowing space for curiosity, creativity, and mistakes. It was about creating an environment where learning was not a chore, but an adventure. And more than that, it was about being present, truly present, for Lily, for Clara, for himself. The days that followed were filled with similar moments of connection. Clara continued her lessons with Lily, but Lucas began to see things differently. He wasn't just watching from the sidelines anymore. He was involved. He found himself laughing along with them, asking questions and encouraging Lily's creativity. His rigid schedule began to loosen, and he started to see the value and the spontaneity that Clara brought into their lives. One evening, as Clara was packing up her things to leave, Lucas stopped her in the doorway. "Clara, he began, his voice faltering for a moment. He wasn't sure how to put it into words, but he knew he needed to express something that had been weighing on him. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything. For showing me a different way." Clara smiled, her expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Lucas. You were the one who was open to the possibility of change." He nodded slowly, realizing that she was right. The change hadn't come from Clara alone. It had come from his willingness to let go, to trust, to let go of the need to control every aspect of his life, especially when it came to his daughter's future. That night, as he sat in the quiet of his office, Lucas reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. He had spent so many years building walls around his emotions, around his relationships, around his daughter's future. But now, as he looked out the window at the city lights, he understood that those walls were doing more harm than good. It wasn't about control. It was about connection. And in that realization, Lucas felt the weight of the last few months lift from his shoulders. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of change. Not of the unknown. And most importantly, not of letting go.